Hi, I'm Adrian Saville. Thank you for joining me on day 6 of our lockdown vlog. We remain in a state of high social distance, so Jess is at home, low social distancing, homeschooling. And I'm going to use yesterday's format of Q&A, which has been fed by the activity on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you to everyone who's engaged with us, to pick up on 3 conversations going on through those various interactions. The first one is, how big is the problem? The second is, do we really need the IMF? And the third is, how do we get away from here? In that order. Hanif Haider says, do we really need the IMF? And here's a suggestion why we might need the IMF or some other lender to help us square away this problem. And in a picture, in a number, 3,982 trillion. That's the size of South Africa's government debt. Now, in and of itself, that number is a little bit meaningless, because 3,982, do we have the ability to pay it back? And so the conventional way of measuring government debt is to put it up against GDP. And so we get a debt to GDP ratio. If we put South Africa's 3.9 trillion rand debt up against our 5.5 trillion GDP, you get to about 60% debt to GDP. That's a concerning number. It's not alarming. However, it becomes concerning and then worrying when you do a couple of things to this number. The first is, here's a picture of the trend in South Africa's debt to GDP ratio, and pay particular attention to the last 10 or 15 years, where the debt to GDP ratio has marched steadily higher. The second is that number undercounts, because we don't add into this debt to GDP ratio, as reported here, state-owned enterprise and municipal debt. When we add those figures in, it adds another 15%. So our 60% debt to GDP ratio quickly becomes a 75% debt to GDP ratio. And then I want to share with you a third chart, or a third picture. And this I borrow from Renee Volkroff, who last year, at the end of the year, did some projections on what South Africa's debt to GDP ratio would look like under various growth scenarios, sort of a low, medium, and high growth scenario. All of those growth scenarios are off the table, with COVID and the crisis taking us into sharply negative territory. And that means GDP is going smaller, which means the debt to GDP number is going higher. And when we put those 3 figures into the equation, or those 3 factors into the equation, the steady upward march in debt to GDP, the fact that the figure undercounts by overlooking state-owned enterprises and municipalities, and that the denominator, GDP, is going down, not up, you get from hand-wringing into deeply worrying territory, into conversations about the IMF. But before the IMF comes into the equation, markets have already responded. Ashraf Garda retweeted our chart from last night. This was put out by our Chief Investment Officer, Samantha Stein. She shared this on social media. And it shows South African government bonds relative to other government bonds that make up the World Government Bond Index. South Africa's interest rate stands head and shoulders above other governments that are borrowing in international and domestic markets. Why so high? Well, I think the response to how big is the problem is why so high. That South Africa is increasingly in worryingly indebtedness territory. And as our ability to service that debt becomes of greater concern, the cost of borrowing for the South African government marches steadily higher. And so now our cost of borrowing stands at about 11%, versus Mexico, which is borrowing at 6%, versus the United States, which is borrowing at 0%. And this leads Buddy Wells, who's been sharing volumes of stuff on Twitter with me, thank you, to make the observation that, well, perhaps we don't need the IMF. We could actually just print that there is the capacity of the South African Reserve Bank to print this money. And indeed, that is the case. And he shows in a really informative chart the size of South Africa's debt relative to other countries. And in showing this data, I think the point is well made, that all said and told, South Africa's debt to GDP is actually not that alarming, that there are other countries in much worse shape than us. However, he goes on to make the point, which should not be lost, that it's not just the size of our debt, it is this interest rate, it's this 11 or so percent that we are now obliged to pay to service this debt, which takes us into runaway debt territory. And anyone who's experienced interest rate charges that just compound and compound and compound know exactly the type of problem that the South African government now faces in this daunting 11% interest rate environment. So we could potentially print our way out of this problem, and we don't have to go to the IMF. However, if we reach for that lever, there's at least one critical principle and one deep concern. The critical principle is that this is the lever that Venezuela and Zimbabwe reached for in trying to solve their social issues. So we want to think long and hard about reaching for any printing lever. The second is just to make the observation in the broader context of very, very anxious financial markets, that one of the features of South Africa's economic, industrial, institutional landscape that really sets us apart from many other emerging markets is the strength, robustness, discipline, and track record of the South African Reserve Bank. So if we're going to make any sort of noises or utterances in the direction of printing of money, and I'm using air commas there, we need to be absolutely mindful. And then Michael Traherne makes the, I think, on the money point that regardless of whether we print money or borrow money from the IMF, what really matters is how we allocate that money. And it all boils down to the shrewd, astute, careful, and effective allocation of that valuable capital. A last point, and now I'm borrowing here from Tata Masigo, who shared a lovely chart showing the most widely used apps or the most widely downloaded apps off the iStore, and compares South Africa to the United States. And perhaps just to be colorful or a little bit animated for a moment and get away from the seriousness of economics, South Africa perhaps is showing others the way out here, with the two most downloaded apps being House Party and Tinder. I'm not sure how on earth South African downloaders think they're going to get access to this Tinder application, but perhaps House Party is a way to at least find some social connection in a world of high social distancing. Bad humor, but hopefully a lighter note in a tough environment. Thank you to everyone for your engagement, your ongoing activity. There were two questions put to me quite late in the day, which I will pick up on in tomorrow's vodcast. The first from Zweletho Dlamini. You've carried on with your questions. Thank you. And his observation is there a way out of here other than QE? Absolutely, we can talk about that tomorrow. And from Corne, who's asking us specifically about what have we done to our portfolios to cope with and navigate this environment. I'll share some ideas tomorrow of what we've been doing to our portfolios, amongst others our Reg 28 portfolios. And if you're not convinced of the nature of South Africa's debt problem, in the short time that I've been talking to you, South Africa's debt has gone from 3982294 to 3982298. The number marches steadily higher. Thank you for joining me. Please keep sending, please keep sharing, please keep safe, stay home, stay in touch. See you tomorrow.